Cold wind pushed across the yard, carrying fine dust that clung to every surface it touched. The barracks stood stiff and gray in the early light, their wooden frames creaking as if the winter had settled into their bones. Inside the women's compound, the prisoners moved with small, careful steps, bodies wrapped in thin layers that had long lost their warmth. 18 months without a true bath had left their skin dull and cracked, a reminder of the world they had crossed and the harsh months that followed. The dirt had become a second skin, one they feared to lose. The girl at the center of the group kept her arms folded tight across her chest, her breath shallow, as she stared at the ground. She felt the dust gather against her lashes each time the wind shifted, but she did not lift a hand to wipe it away. Touching her own face felt too revealing, too vulnerable. Around her, whispers rose and fell, carrying edges of panic as the women watched American soldiers assemble panels, pipes, and a metal tank that began to release faint curls of steam. A shower area. The thought alone sent a wave of tension through the compound. The women braced themselves. They had lived with the belief that moments like this brought humiliation, punishment, or exposure meant to break them further. Their shoulders tightened, their breaths grew uneven, and even the smallest movement from a guard made them flinch. The girl's fingers shook against her sleeves as she imagined the water hitting her skin, stripping away the only shield she had left. The Americans worked quietly, not stepping close, not raising their voices. Still, fear rose like frost along a window pane, cold and spreading. No one understood why they would offer warmth now, not after months of silence and caution. The girl watched steam drift upward, her pulse tightening as the distance between intention and consequence filled with dread. For a moment, the camp seemed to hold its breath, caught between what the women expected and what waited beyond their fear. The women huddled close as the wind shifted, carrying thin ribbons of steam from the shower pipes across the yard. Their voices dropped to hushed breaths. Words traded so quietly they barely reached beyond their small circle. Each whisper carried pieces of warnings learned long before captivity, fragments of fear stitched into them since childhood. They spoke of stations where prisoners were stripped without mercy, of water used not for cleansing but for humiliation, of foreigners who watched without compassion. These stories rose now with the same weight as the dust on their skin, shaping every tremor in their hands. The girl kept her eyes lowered, remembering how elders had described foreign soldiers as men who used exposure to break dignity. She recalled being told that a woman's honor could be taken not through force alone, but through shame, through being seen in weakness, through having the last layer of herself washed away by strangers. The thought of stepping beneath running water while others stood near felt like walking into a place where nothing of her would remain whole. Their fear grew as they imagined what waited behind the wooden panels. The sound of water dripping from metal echoed through the compound, each drop a small reminder of everything they believed might follow. Their shoulders tightened, breaths shortened, and they clutched their worn clothing as if fabric alone could shield them from the unknown. Yet across the yard, the Americans moved with a calm that unsettled them even more. They checked pipes, tested valves, and spoke to one another in steady tones. No shouting, no aggression, no hurried motions meant to intimidate. Their stillness contradicted every warning the women carried, creating a tension deeper than noise ever could. Uncertainty pressed hardest of all. Fear lived in the space between myth and reality, and no one yet knew which one the water would reveal. The sergeant stood a short distance from the shower panels, his boots planted firmly in the cold dirt as the wind moved across the compound. He kept his hands loose at his sides, resisting every instinct to step forward and offer reassurance. Instead, he watched, quietly, steadily, letting the weight of the scene settle around him. Years in uniform had taught him to read a battlefield, but this was something different. The fear in the women's faces was not the sharp fear of danger, but the deep, trembling kind that came from wounds no medic could see. He noticed the smallest movements first. A shoulder flinching when a pipe clanged, fingers curling tight into fabric, heads lowering whenever a guard shifted his stance. The girl at the center of the group held herself rigid, as if any sudden motion might shatter something she was desperate to keep intact. When the wind carried the sound of water testing through the pipes, her knees bent slightly, a subtle collapse she fought to hide. The sergeant let out a slow breath. He understood orders. Assemble the station, ensure sanitation, follow procedure. But none of that mattered beside the raw fear tightening. The women's posture. Duty told him to keep the line moving, complete the task, maintain discipline. Compassion urged him to step back, to give them space, to acknowledge that what seemed simple to him felt like a threat to them. He stayed still. Stillness, he sensed, was the only language they might trust. He watched the girl's hands tremble as she held her sleeves, watched her eyes dart between the steam and the soldiers, unsure which posed greater danger. The others mirrored her fear, moving as one body, bound by shared warnings and quiet dread. The sergeant felt the conflict settle in his chest. A tug between doing his job and honoring the humanity standing before him. So he grounded himself in silence, letting the moment unfold without pressure, hoping that restraint could offer what reassurance could not. They carried the warnings long before they carried the dirt on their skin. In the dim corners of schoolyards, in whispered lessons passed down through families, the girls had been taught that foreign soldiers used water not to cleanse, but to shame. The stories had come to them in fragments. Tales of prisoners forced beneath harsh streams, stripped of dignity, while enemies watched, their weakness laid bare for ridicule. No one questioned these teachings. They were absorbed quietly, shaping the borders of fear long before war ever touched their lives. Some of the women remembered how instructors spoke of cleansing rituals, meant to break a captive's spirit, how exposure could be a punishment more devastating than any restraint. They recalled warnings that dishonor could follow a woman back across oceans, staining her family as much as herself. These lessons, repeated in darkness and secrecy, became part of how they understood survival. A body revealed was a body defeated. A moment of vulnerability was a wound that never closed. Now, standing in the camp with steam rising gently from metal pipes, those old shadows tightened their grip. The simple act of showering, ordinary to their captors, felt dangerous in ways difficult to name. Public bathing meant being seen. Being seen meant losing control, and losing control meant risking the identity they had been told must stay guarded at all costs. No soldier raised a hand against them. No command came to strip or hurry. Yet the fear persisted, living in the space between memory and imagination. The Americans' calm movements only deepened the confusion. This quiet contradicted everything they had been warned to expect. Their terror did not come from the water. It came from the lessons taught in the dark, lessons now meeting a truth they did not yet know how to trust. The Americans filled metal buckets with warm water, letting steam rise into the cold air as they placed clean towels on a bench beside the doorway. Their movements were careful, deliberate, each gesture meant to show safety rather than command. Still, the women stood frozen several steps away, their bodies drawn tight as if the very threshold could swallow them whole. The girl at the front stared at the doorway with wide, unblinking eyes, breathing in short, uneven bursts. The warmth drifting toward her did nothing to soften the dread tightening her posture. When one of the soldiers adjusted a valve and the pipes hissed, the women recoiled all at once, shrinking back as if struck. Their reaction was immediate and instinctive, a reflex shaped by months of fear and years of warnings. The girl stumbled, catching herself only long enough to avoid falling outright, her hands gripping her sleeves until her knuckles whitened. The others reached for her, not to move forward, but to retreat farther from the shower's entrance. The sergeant lifted a hand, not to touch, not to guide, only to signal the men to pause. The Americans stepped back, puzzled but patient, watching the tension ripple through the group like a shiver across water. They exchanged quiet glances, unsure how something as simple as bathing could provoke such terror. The towels remained untouched. The warm water cooled slowly in its buckets. Then, the smallest woman in the group swayed. Her knees buckled without warning, and she crumpled into the dirt, not from force but from exhaustion so deep it hollowed her movements. The others dropped beside her, shielding her instinctively even from gentle hands that did not reach for them. The sergeant knelt a distance away, understanding in that moment that hunger, cold, and grime were not the true barriers. Fear had settled deeper than any wound, deeper than any deprivation, and no amount of warmth or water could reach it by force. The Americans did not move closer. They simply waited, realizing that the need was great, but the fear was greater still. The sergeant took a slow step back, then another, creating a wider space between himself and the women. His boots pressed quietly into the dirt, the sound muted beneath the steady hum of the water tank. He kept his hands visible, palms relaxed, making sure every motion carried the same message: no pressure, no expectations. The other soldiers followed his lead, easing into a loose semicircle several yards away, their silence gentler than any reassurance spoken aloud. Steam drifted from the shower pipes in soft, wavering ribbons, rising into the cold morning air like breath from some quiet creature. The warmth it carried spread slowly across the yard, thinning the sharp bite of early spring and softening the harshness of the wooden panels. The atmosphere shifted, not enough to erase fear, but enough to dull its edges. The girl felt the difference. The air no longer pressed so heavily on her shoulders. She stood very still at first, arms locked tight across her chest, gaze fixed on the dirt. But without the soldier's nearness crowding her thoughts, something in her posture loosened, her back curved less rigidly, her fingers uncurled by a fraction. She lifted her head just slightly, drawn not by command but by the quiet space that now surrounded her. The others watched the sergeant too, noting how far he had moved, how still he remained. They sensed his restraint before they understood it. His distance gave them permission to breathe, to observe the steam rather than the men, to consider the doorway not as a trap, but as a possibility. Then, as the steam drifted between them, the girl raised her eyes. It was only for a heartbeat, a brief alignment of gaze and intention, but it held more weight than any movement before. Her eyes met the sergeant's across the open space. Fear still present, but no longer the only emotion there. For the first time, she looked not at the danger she expected, but at the man who had chosen not to approach her. The girl shifted her weight as another breeze swept through the compound, lifting the edge of her tattered sleeve. The movement was small, almost accidental, but it loosened the layer of dust that had settled thickly across her skin. For the first time, the sergeant saw what lay beneath. A faint patch of discoloration traced the line of her forearm, the kind that came not from a single blow, but from months of pressure, strain, and cold. Higher on her wrist, where the fabric slipped further, the skin appeared raw, worn thin by friction or long neglected wounds. None of it was fresh. All of it spoke of survival lived at the edge of endurance. He felt the recognition strike him, a tightening behind his ribs that he forced himself to steady. The instinct to react, to show concern, to step closer, to offer aid, rose quickly, but he pressed it down. Any sign of alarm would only deepen the fear she carried. So he kept his posture unchanged, his expression calm, allowing the moment to pass without drawing attention to what he had seen. She lowered her sleeve again, unaware of what had been revealed. Her gaze remained cautious, but no longer fixed to the ground. She watched him as though waiting for a signal she could not name. The sergeant held her eyes for a quiet second, not with pity, but with a tempered understanding, trying to meet her fear without overwhelming it. Inside him, conflict spread like slow, moving heat. Orders told him to maintain procedure. Humanity urged him to acknowledge the suffering hidden beneath grime and silence. The dirt on her skin had shielded her more than it concealed her. The thought struck him with a weight he had not expected. What else had been hidden by the months she spent without water? What parts of her had been held together only by the thin barrier she now feared to surrender? He looked away gently, granting her privacy without stepping back into indifference. The injuries were not the whole story, but they were enough to deepen the quiet resolve forming in him. Compassion demanded patience. And patience, he sensed, would be the only bridge she might trust. Steam drifted in soft waves from the metal tank as the soldiers arranged the space with quiet intention. They placed clean towels on a low bench, folding each one with care, as if the simple act might steady the air around them. A small bar of soap was set beside them, its pale surface untouched, waiting without demand. No voices rose. No gestures urged her forward. The shower stood ready, not as an order, but as an offering. The sergeant stepped back once more, widening the distance between the women and the men. His boots settled into the dirt with a muted thud, and then he went still, becoming part of the background rather than the center of attention. The other soldiers mirrored him, forming a quiet half-circle far from the doorway. Their stillness carried a message clearer than words. The choice was hers. Steam curled upward, softening the harsh outlines of the wooden panels. The warmth drifted toward the girl like a gentle invitation, wrapping the cold morning in something almost tender. She stared at the towels first, then at the soap, her breath trembling as she tried to understand why no one moved to push her closer. For the first time, nothing was taken from her. Nothing was demanded. She took one step. Her foot pressed cautiously into the dirt, testing the space as if it might shift beneath her. When no one reacted, she took another. Her arms remained crossed over her chest, her body tight with instinctive fear, but the distance around her felt different now. Open instead of dangerous. She reached the doorway and hesitated, watching the steam rise in slow spirals. The warmth brushed against her face, carrying no threat, no judgment, just heat, just air, just possibility. Then, with a breath that shuddered through her entire frame, she stepped inside. Warm mist curled around her as she stepped beneath the narrow stream of water. The first drops touched her skin with a heat so gentle it startled her, rolling down through the layers of dust that had clung to her for more than a year. She froze, bracing for something she could not name, but the water only continued, soft, steady, unhurried. It traced the line of her shoulder, carried away the grit along her arm, and settled over her like a second skin made of steam and warmth instead of fear. Outside the shower panels, the other women stood silent. Their eyes followed every small movement, stunned not by the sight itself, but by the absence of threat. They had expected commands, punishment, humiliation. Instead, they watched her stand alone in the rising steam, unguarded yet untouched, her posture loosening one breath at a time. The scene felt impossible, like witnessing a rule quietly being rewritten before their eyes. The Americans remained far back, silhouettes blurred by the haze drifting through the yard. Their stillness held the moment steady, allowing her vulnerability to unfold without pressure. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Even the sergeant kept his gaze lowered at intervals, as if protecting her privacy by refusing to claim the moment as his. She lifted her face slightly, letting the warm stream fall across her brow. Her breathing slowed, smoothing into a rhythm she had not felt in months. As the water carried away the dirt, a faint shift touched her expression, small, fragile, but unmistakable. Relief. Not full, not free, but rising from beneath the fear, like something long buried, finding its first breath. Steam gathered around her shoulders, blurring the lines of her frame, making her seem lighter, almost renewed. And for the first time since captivity began, the camp watched not a prisoner obeying, but a girl reclaiming the smallest piece of herself. She sat wrapped in a towel near the doorway after the water stopped, steam still drifting from her skin as if the shower had loosened not only dirt, but memories she could no longer keep contained. The women formed a quiet circle around her, giving space yet staying close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. The air felt different now, warmer, softened by the simple act she had survived. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, almost swallowed by the morning breeze. She said she had feared being seen long before captivity. In her village, she explained, a woman's body was bound to honor, guarded with silence and strict rules. Exposure meant shame, and shame carried weight far beyond the moment itself. Even as a child, she had learned that dignity could be broken by a single gaze. That fear grew sharper during the war, when rumors spread that being captured meant losing everything that marked her as respectable. What remained of herself, worth felt tied to keeping every part of her hidden, even from herself. She hesitated as she described the months that followed. The marches, the hunger, the overcrowded shelters where survival blurred into something smaller and harder. Layer by layer, she said, the war had stripped pieces of her identity. The way she walked, the way she held her head, the certainty she once had in her place in the world. Dirt had become a barrier, a shield she wore to stay unseen, to protect what little dignity she believed she had left. As she spoke, the towel slipped slightly from her shoulder, and she pulled it close again, not out of fear now, but from habit built over months of guarding herself. Her eyes lifted, steady but sad, holding the quiet truth she had carried alone for too long. The war had not only taken her freedom, it had taken the person she used to be. Steam still drifted faintly from the shower panels as the women settled into a quiet that felt different from the silence they had lived in for months. It was not the silence of fear now, but of reflection, an unsteady calm that came only after something long believed had begun to unravel. The girl sat wrapped in her towel, her posture softening as she watched the Americans move about the yard. Their actions were simple: folding blankets, clearing buckets, checking pipes. Ordinary tasks, yet each one stood in sharp contrast to the warnings she had carried across oceans. She remembered the myths taught in dark rooms, whispered by elders who believed they were preparing their daughters for survival. She had been told that foreign soldiers used water as a weapon, that being forced to bathe meant losing dignity, privacy, even identity. But here the water had been offered gently. No hands reached toward her, no voices commanded. The Americans had stepped back instead of forward, letting warmth do what force never could. The gap between the stories she had been told and the truth unfolding before her widened with every passing moment. It left her unsteady, not in fear now, but in recognition. She had expected cruelty. Instead, she found patience. She had braced for humiliation. Instead, she found space to breathe. The myths she once held tightly began to loosen, slipping away like the dirt that had washed from her skin. Kindness, she realized, was not loud. It did not demand attention. It lived in humility. The way the sergeant kept his distance, the way towels were left within reach, but untouched, the way the soldiers turned their gazes aside to protect a dignity they knew mattered. Warmth had come not only from the water, but from restraint, from quiet respect, from a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. The women watched the soldiers with new eyes, seeing no triumph in their faces, no expectation of gratitude, only the steady calm of people who believed care was part of their duty. And in that steadiness, the old lessons began to lose their power. The water had cleansed more than her skin. It had begun to cleanse the shadows left by fear, teaching a truth the war had never allowed her to imagine. Humanity could survive even where myths once ruled. The sun rose gently over the camp, casting a pale gold light across the yard. Frost clung to the ground in thin crystals, melting slowly as warmth spread through the morning air. The girl stepped out from the shelter with careful movements, a clean towel draped around her shoulders. Its softness still felt unfamiliar, but it carried the warmth of hands that had offered it without demand. Nearby, a soldier placed a small loaf of warm bread on a bench, stepping back before she approached. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a quiet weight that settled softly in her chest. She reached for the bread with steady fingers, its heat seeping into her palms. For months, her world had been shaped by fear, scarcity, and warnings that left no room for trust. Now, in this small corner of the camp, the morning felt changed, not because hardship had ended, but because something gentle had entered the space where dread once lived. The towel, the bread, the warmth rising from the showers behind her, each became a symbol of a new truth slowly pushing aside the shadows of the old. Around her, the other women gathered in silence. They watched the Americans clean the yard, adjust water lines, and prepare the next meal. There was no rush, no barked orders, no harshness. Just steady work, carried out with a kind of quiet discipline that neither demanded acknowledgement nor sought control. Their restraint had become part of the lesson the women were learning. Compassion could be offered without ceremony, without expectation, without taking anything in return. The moment felt small, yet it echoed with something larger. Across the world, in hidden corners of the war, similar acts of humanity unfolded. Medics tending to wounded enemies, villagers sharing food with those once feared, soldiers choosing mercy over retaliation. These stories rarely made it into official reports. They were too quiet, too gentle, too human to survive beside the noise of conflict. But they were real, and they mattered. As the girl lifted the bread to her lips, the silence around her finally broke. Not with words, but with a softness that eased through the group. Fear loosened, breath steadied, and for the first time in a long while, the morning did not feel like a threat. The war had divided their worlds. Humanity, in moments like this, began to heal them.